Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Laura Cohen, and I'm the Executive Director of the Harriet and Kenneth Kufferberg Holocaust Center at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. Our mission is to use the lessons of the Holocaust to educate current and future generations about the ramifications of prejudice, racism, and stereotyping. The Kufferberg Holocaust Center in Bayside, New York, is situated on the traditional land of the Mantinecock people who continue to live here today. We offer gratitude and respect to all of the Indigenous people of Turtle Island, past, present, and future, including the Lenape and Shinnecock peoples. What I just read is what we call a land acknowledgement. This is a statement recognizing that the land we all occupy in the course of our daily lives, including our schools, jobs, parks, and homes, as well as the names of towns and roads, was first inhabited by another group of people who were forcibly expelled and murdered. Today, we identify those crimes for what they are: mass atrocities and genocide. These horrors continue to have devastating political, social, psychological, economic, and environmental impacts upon and within Native American and Indigenous communities. Today's event, Growing Up Asian and Jewish, is a conversation about the intersection of race, religion, and ethnicity in the increasing number of households that are Jewish American and Asian American. It has its origins in the racially motivated violence against the Asian American community, which has scarily increased since the COVID-19 pandemic began. But xenophobia and racism against Asian American people has existed long before and is rooted in part from a lack of seeing this incredibly diverse community, first and foremost as human beings. This is absolutely also connected to the Holocaust and the extermination of 6 million Jewish people and millions more other victim groups targeted by the Nazis. Our special guests today are the authors of Jew-Asian, Race, Religion, and Identity for America's Newest Jews by Dr. Helen Keong Kim, Associate Dean of Faculty Development and Professor of Sociology at Whitman College, and Dr. Noah Samuel Levitt, Director of Student Engagement at Whitman College. This event is co-sponsored by the Jewish Studies Department at Queens College and the Center for the Study of Genocide and Human Rights at Rutgers University. Please be sure to submit your questions via the Q&A button on your screen, as we've disabled the chat for security reasons. Now, to kick things off, please join me in welcoming Dr. Trevor B Milton, who will moderate today's discussion. Dr. Milton is Associate Professor of Sociology and Criminology at Queensborough Community College at the City University of New York. His areas of research include prison reform, adolescent criminal behavior, deviant subcultures, race and racism, urban ethnography, new masculinities, and the intersection of class, gender, and race in identity formation. He's the author of Overcoming the Magnetism of Street Life, Crime-Engaged Youth and the Programs that Transform Them, and co-author of The Con Men Hustling in New York City. Dr. Milton, the floor is yours.
Good stuff. Good afternoon, everybody. Again, my name is Dr. Trevor Milton. I'm an associate professor here at QCC. We're here to talk about today's talk, Intersecting Identities, Growing Up Asian and Jewish. And I've been tasked to be the moderator for this because of I do a lot of research on race and racism. And it's, particularly today, it's like, what a time to be talking about race and racism. And I understand that in the same way that a lot of people have COVID fatigue right now, probably a lot of people also have fatigue over talking about race and racism. Sometimes these conversations get uncomfortable. Sometimes these conversations get fatiguing. And I was starting to think about, the importance of having and continuing to have conversations like this. I was just listening to Barack Obama's speech at this climate summit the other day. He was talking about global climate change. And he was saying, what will the future look like if we don't address climate change today? And anybody that hears climate change speeches are often like, yeah, let's go, let's do this, let's make these changes. But the reality is you have a $2.1 trillion, oil industry to discuss when it comes to that. We have a lot of things to undo and a lot of things to dismantle when it comes to that. So that's, global climate change is hard work. And to undo institutions of racism, that's also hard work. And we do need to continue to have these conversations. So for example, if we start talking about diversity and inclusion, some might be a little fatigued talking about that. But diversity is equally as important, is very important for us to drive this culture forward. Diversity, if you look at QCC, for example, Queensborough Community College has the students represent 139 different nationalities, 87 different languages, so many different perspectives. And that diversity allows us to learn from each other. It allows us to create new ideas. It allows us to innovate our own cultures and to create new ideas and create greater opportunities for those that come after us. So again, when talking about race and racism, even the discussion of, something like privilege. Privilege has been an interesting thing to discuss in the past few years, because oftentimes when somebody has privilege, they're unaware of it, whether that's white privilege, male privilege. It took me a while to even recognize my own privileges as a man in society. But then it is important to acknowledge it without necessarily punishing oneself for it. This is what all of this work is about. And so today's talk focuses on the concept of a model minority. This is, if you've heard of the term model minority, this was invented by a sociologist by the name of William Peterson in 1966, talking about Japanese Americans and how Japanese Americans, 21 years, were able to pull themselves up from being in internment camps in the United States to being very successful educationally and financially. And so the model minority is basically, it's a term that used to describe what minorities should act like, to be successful, to follow the laws, and to be meek and to be quiet. But that serves a very important function in the racial hierarchy in the United States. It allows people to point at what may be called what William Peterson called problem minorities, and say, why aren't you as good as them? So these are the things that will be discussed today. Today's speakers are going to be talking about intermarriage as it relates to that diversity and how that shapes our future generations. I too am a product of intermarriage. It's an interracial marriage. My father's Black and my mother's white. And I've been exposed to these two worlds, these two cultures, these two worlds that at times don't accept me and at other times pull me right in. But at the same time, it's helped me to really solidify my interest in this topic of race and racism. So for today, I would like to introduce our two guest speakers. We have Dr. Helen Kim and Dr. Noah Levitt. Dr. Helen Kim is a professor of sociology at Whitman College in Walla Walla, Washington. Her scholarship focuses on race and American Judaism in the contemporary era. Her scholarship has been profiled in the New York Times, NPR, and Huffington Post. Dr. Noah Levitt is the director of Career and Community Engagement, of the Career and Community Engagement Center at Whitman College, where he's also a research associate in the sociology department. Today, they're going to be talking about their book, Jew-Asian, Race, Religion, and Identity for America's Newest Jews. So I'll turn the floor over to Drs. Kim and Dr. Levitt.
Thank you, Dr. Milton. Hello, everybody. Greetings from Walla Walla, Washington, where the sun is shining and the leaf blowers may be going off and on a little bit. Noah and I are really honored and excited to spend some time with you all. And we just wanted to extend a special thank you to the Kufferberg Holocaust Center for this really special invitation. And, as Dr. Milton was talking, and as Dr. Cohen was also talking about the mission of the Kufferberg Holocaust Center, a couple things popped in my brain. One, while what we're about to talk about is not explicitly related to the Holocaust or Holocaust studies, I think the intention that Noah and I had in terms of doing the work behind the book and putting it out there in the world was really to try to tell an important story and a story that we didn't think was being previously told as a way of really sort of honoring some of the central tenets in terms of the mission that Dr. Cohen put out there with regards to what the center really values and focuses on. So we hope that that comes through as we're talking about our book. And as Dr. Milton was talking about sort of the fatigue and the exhaustion with regards to having another conversation about race and racism, I definitely go there and I can empathize with that. And I think one of the things that I also want to hold on to is the possibility of hope in terms of these conversations. We have to have these conversations. We have to talk about difficult things. And I think the point is to sort of use that learning and understanding to sort of hold on to hope and the possibility of progress and change. So thank you, Dr. Milton, Dr. Cohen, for those really wonderful words. So what Noah and I thought we would do is pretty simple. We have just sort of a few main goals and things that we want to communicate to you all. And they do relate to our book, Jew-Asian. So we wanted to tell you a little bit about why we decided to write the book. There's a personal as well as an academic component to why we decided to write the book. We also wanted to tell you about what we did in terms of the people we talked to and the things that we found. And if there's some time, I think because we wrote the book about 5 years ago, Noah and I wanted to have sort of a little bit of a back and forth between the two of us with regards to sort of our current reflections in 2021, looking back on our work about 5 years later. So that's sort of a general outline of how we wanted to use the time today. And we're very excited to have Q&A at the end. So I will hand it over to Noah to kind of kick us off in terms of why we wrote the book.
Sure, thanks. And I also feel very honored to be here. Helen and I are sitting right now at Whitman College. We are on the traditional homeland of the Walla Walla, Cayuse, and Umatilla peoples who ceded the land that we're on to the United States government in the Treaty of 1855. So we're fortunate that our home base here at Whitman College has since 2017 been in a formal memorandum of agreement to partner with the local Indigenous communities and leaders here for projects that are significant. But anyway, I think I want to move us off of the West Coast and into the Midwest, where it's getting to be colder out. And I'm thinking back to 1997, when Helen and I were both in a graduate program. Students, if you're listening, little story here maybe for you that would be interesting. We were both in a graduate program of social sciences at the University of Chicago. It was a fairly large program, 100 people in our cohort, and we didn't know each other, but mutual friend had a dinner party. And it was a cold night, and people were just being very convivial. And I walked in out of the minus 15 degree Hyde Park winter weather and saw this beautiful woman over at the kitchen working on some complicated series of desserts, these little chocolate, beautiful galettes, I think. And of course, I went up and made a very good, strong first impression. I probably had some charming words, and I was ready to throw my lot in with this pastry chef that I saw. And it turns out that my feelings of enthusiasm and energy and fondness were really not reciprocated at all. In fact, it turned out that I made a very bad first impression, but kind of stayed with it and wound up asking Helen out a few weeks later for a date. And we went out and we went out for a drink at the top of the then Sears Tower. And we kind of got into conversation, and we realized that we both were young people whose fathers had died kind of tragically, very early and unexpectedly, and wound up spending our first date talking about being kids of deceased fathers. And it was this very intense exposure to a new person, and kind of brought us together as we were talking about our families and talking about kind of our memories of being, kids of really amazing fathers and losing them and what that meant. And kind of that really was what started our relationship, and kind of started spending time together. We started asking questions about, oh, okay, well, tell me a little bit about your family. You're from a West Coast Korean American family. I'm from an upstate New York white Jewish family. What's that all about? And we couldn't drop these questions that we kept asking each other as we were thinking about kind of what was involved in all of these seemingly different kinds of aspects of our backgrounds apparently coming together in this relationship that was forming. And that really was where we started wondering, what is it to have individuals create couples or partnerships where all of the different parts of kind of Asian backgrounds or Asian American families and Jewish families and East Coast families and West Coast families and white families and Asian families, what did it mean to have all that in play? And that's really what started the origin of this project. And then it really kind of kicked off when we were about to have our first child years later. And we suddenly realized we were going to be parents of kids of parents of us, and trying to figure out what is it going to mean to have all of that complexity that we had been talking about for years suddenly in this little being that was going to be in our household. And so that's really where our research project got underway, was us trying to make sense of what it was going to be in a household where all of this was now in play. So that's just, I think, to Dr. Milton's kind of story about being a young person growing up in a mixed household. That's sort of what also generated our interest in really trying to investigate households like ours and what that would mean for us and our kid or kids, as it would be.
Yeah, and I would say that, as Noah's talking about the primarily personal aspects of sort of the impetus behind writing the book, there are a few things that I want to emphasize in terms of the academic questions that we were also asking as well. And before I get into that, or to provide a little bit of context, Noah and I met in 1997, which was 30 years after 1967 and the landmark Loving v. Virginia a Supreme Court ruling that basically overturned the illegality of interracial marriage. So in the larger sort of social and cultural landscape, we were seeing, unsurprisingly, sort of kids of this is one generation post Loving v. Virginia. So we're seeing the sort of the offspring of those marriages, kind of as Noah and I were beginning our own relationship. And just a few years later, in 2000 is a really important year in terms of the census, the United States Census, because it was the first time that the census allowed individuals to choose one or more races as they were filling out the checkboxes in the census. So I just want to kind of say that there's a larger, very important sort of cultural context as we were living out our lives and growing our relationship and our family. The other, I think, important components about the academic questions that we were really interested in engaging with were really around the time at the beginning of the millennial in 2000. There was really sort of this continuation of a narrative around intermarriage within the American Jewish community that really saw intermarriage as sort of the death knell of the Jewish people. So this idea that if a Jew marries a non-Jew and has kids, eventually we will see sort of the disappearance of American Judaism. And as Noah and I were dating and thinking about our own lives, that was just a really interesting story that we responded to in a way, in sort of a kind of a questioning way. Like, is that really the case? Because that's not something that we were experiencing. And we were wondered if we were just unique or if there were other folks who were kind of responding in the same way to this idea that intermarriage was, necessarily meant the death of the Jewish people, because that's not what we were feeling was going on. So I think that sort of, I wanted that experience and our engagement with that narrative really led to a lot of questioning of that story that was out there. I would say just additionally, in terms of the story around intermarriage in the early 2000s, that was really predominantly a narrative that was focused on Ashkenazi Jews who are marrying largely white Christians. And as we were seeing the landscape of intermarriage, what we felt was missing was sort of a lens to look at intermarriage through race. So where was race? Where was racial difference in terms of intermarriages between individuals who are Jewish and individuals who are not Jewish? Because we knew that the larger demographic landscape of the United States was one in which we were seeing increasing numbers of intermarriages across racial lines. So it was sort of with those two questions that we really kind of started our research project in earnest. So we're gonna kind of continue the Helen and Noah shtick here. And I'll hand it back to Noah in terms of sort of taking it to the next step with regards to what it is that we did and who it is that we talked to.
Thanks. So, and just for context, so we approached this in two steps. The first step was to identify and talk with couples who were in what they described as Jewish Asian households. And I'll just say a couple of things about that. And then we continued that because what wound up happening was people said, okay, that's great that you're talking with couples, but like, what's going to happen with the kids? Similar kind of question that we had when our first child, our son Ari, was born. You know, what's going to happen with Ari? People really wanted to know, like, let's get to the second generation of these households. So Helen's going to talk a little bit about once we started talking to that younger generation. But we had the good fortune to work with a think tank in the San Francisco Bay Area called Bechol Lashon, which was in touch with a lot of Jews around the United States who identified as Jews of color or Jews from non-Ashkenazi backgrounds. And we were fortunate to get their help in basically putting out invitations for people to speak with us and indicate their interest in being interviewed. And so we spent about a year and a half putting out invitations for participating in a survey for people inside what they described as Jewish Asian households or Asian Jewish households in whatever way that they describe that or they define that. And so we, over that year and a half, had about 240 or 250 responses, basically people identifying themselves as being willing to be interviewed. And they filled out very long surveys about their own identity, their family identity, their partnership. And so we had the good fortune to be able to go through, hundreds of potential interviewees to try to create an interview pool that gave us the widest types of diversities that we could find within this category of Asian Jewish household. And so that's what we did. We really tried to look at as many different kinds of Asian Jewish partnerships as we could find from the people around the country. And then we wound up getting in touch with 34 of those couples in California, in the New York, Philadelphia area, in the Chicago area to really spend some time with them. And so we interviewed 34 couples and then we're able to kind of develop some understanding about their families. So just a few things that we found. I'm just going to spotlight some of the highlights of what came out of that. And some of those will echo with what Helen was saying. We really saw that no matter what the kind of combination of Asian and Jewish, so whether it was two men, both identified as Jewish, one identified as Asian, or a man and a woman, and the woman was white Ashkenazi and the man was Asian American, older, younger, part of the country. The couples saw themselves as having some kind of overlapping value system that oftentimes was more important than being Asian or being Jewish, at least in terms of how they saw their household running and their relationship working. They saw these huge spheres of similarities, even though they were maybe using different kinds of words or different kinds of terminology. They saw the main core of what they were bringing into their household as being quite similar. And so that was really interesting. And I think it was a little bit surprising to us because we had been going into this thinking that there was going to be much more of kind of a conflict or a divergence of values. But what we heard from the couples over and over was that they really saw alignment. So that was one little early surprise. And then also related to kind of Helen's description of the questions about what was being said at the time about intermarriage for the Jewish community, we saw this incredible commitment to those households in whatever way that they saw themselves as an Asian Jewish household, as creating often religiously driven Jewish practice in lots and lots of different areas, and having an enormous array of what we would say are, very recognizable ways of people practicing their Judaism as part of what they did, and part of what they did, no matter how Jewish or how not Jewish they were, somehow once they were together, that activity was enormous and rich and often quite happy to, I think, put it in a kind of simplistic way. And so we saw these families creating lots and lots of different types of Jewish practice, primarily through a Jewish religion framework. So not culturally Jewish, not going to Zabars, but kind of having Shabbat and observing the holidays and participating in religious communities, whether it's a JCC or a shul or some other kind of organized setting. So that was really interesting. And again, we didn't see the death of Judaism taking place in what were on their face very mixed households. And so again, kind of these surprises coming through. And then I guess the last kind of real surprise was that there was such a difference between how that household practiced and embodied their Jewish identity compared to what they were doing with the Asian or Asian American part of that household, the heritage coming through from the person or both of the people from that side. And there was often, in a different kind of way than there was with the Jewish practice, some sort of worries and anxieties and a little bit of stress around, I feel like I'm kind of losing, what does it mean to be Chinese? Or, my Vietnamese family, I'm kind of not really seeing that in what my daily or my weekly life looks like in this household. And so, there was this really big difference, even though, again, from what appeared at the beginning when the couple described themselves, it wouldn't necessarily be obvious that there was going to be so much Jewish practice and identity and affiliation, and so little of that same kind of life pathway coming through from the other parts of what was in that household. So those were the three things, really, that kind of sense of shared values, that sense of often religiously driven high levels of Jewish practice, and then also the worry about what about the Asian part of our household, what's happening with that. So I'm going to turn it to Helen now for the kids of those kinds of households.
Yeah, so as Noah was alluding to, there's a lot of intense curiosity, I would say, around, well, that's great that you interviewed all these couples, but what about the kids? Because really that's where we sort of see this test of whether or not Jewish identity or Asian identity continues in terms of offspring. So as a follow-up to our interviews with couples, we had the opportunity to, again, sort of interview a very, I would say, diverse group of around 40 adult children of intermarriages like those of the couples who we interviewed. So I just want to, the reason that I'm being very specific in terms of what I'm saying is we did not interview the kids of the couples who we interviewed. We interviewed millennials who were adult children of intermarriages like those of the couples that we interviewed. And again, sort of a wide range of sort of geographical location, Asian ethnicity, affiliation to particular movements within American Judaism. So a pretty diverse set of 40 individuals. And I would say there are a few kind of key things that Noah and I want to hone in on in terms of what we found. The first is in terms of how they think about themselves and their identity. They think about themselves first and foremost as multiracial individuals. And so that to some extent is not surprising if we consider that in 2000, we had the first opportunity through the census for folks to identify as more than one race. and so at their core, they really saw themselves as multiracial individuals. And the way that they would describe that was, I'm white, I'm Asian, I'm sort of Jewish. Jewish is code for white. I'm Korean. So some kind of hanging on to a multiplicity of racial identities in terms of their self-concept and their self-identity. And that's how they walked in the world. I would say the second thing in terms of how it is that intermarriage and identity specific to being Jewish and Asian plays out for these adult kids. This is a group that really, really had a strong sense of attachment to both being Jewish as well as being ethnically Asian. So whether that it's an expression of their Korean heritage or their Japanese heritage or their Vietnamese heritage, they really felt a very strong sense of being both Jewish as well as Asian. And one of the things that was interesting to find out in terms of the strength of Jewish practice in the homes and the communities of the couples that we interviewed, we found that there was actually some similarity in terms of a completely different set of children, but children who were born to similar, to intermarriages, in terms of their growing up with a very strong sense of either home-based practice, affiliation with a congregation, affiliation with some sort of Jewish community that I would say Noah and I were pretty surprised by. So, really strong sense of both being Jewish as well as Asian. So those things are all lovely and seem to be great on the surface. But I think the juxtaposition in terms of our conversations with these adult children was that even though they did have a strong sense of Jewish identity and Asian identity, it wasn't without some pain. And that pain was often walking as a multiracial individual, as somebody who didn't code physically or racially in a way that fit in particular spaces. There was a constant questioning of who it is that they were through something that is called microaggressions. So microaggressions are these sort of day-to-day, very often unintentional expressions to people from marginalized backgrounds where there's a challenge to who it is that you are. And it's just, it's a sort of a constant, almost expected thing. So I'll give you a few examples of the ways that our interviewees who are adult kids talked about microaggressions that they experienced that were related to being Jewish. So one common thing is, somebody walks into a Jewish space or a non-Jewish space and maybe doesn't code as Ashkenazi or Ashken normative. And they're often met with, it's like, wow, how could you possibly, that's so funny, you're Jewish? How is that possible? No, you're only half Jewish, right? You're not fully Jewish. This idea that there's this constant challenge to who it is that they are as Jews, even though they themselves felt very firm and secure in terms of who it is that they are and their Jewish identity. And I would just say, one of the things that our interviewees talked about is how it is that they responded to those microaggressions. And for those of you who are on the East Coast and maybe members of Central Synagogue in Manhattan, when we talk about microaggressions with the folks that we interviewed, we're always reminded of the story that Rabbi Angela Buckdahl-Warnick talks about, where she, as a Korean American Jewish person going to Israel, somebody who felt very strongly engaged and fully Jewish. She has a story where she talks about going to Israel and feeling as though she just didn't fit in. People were constantly questioning her for being Jewish. And she just wanted to sort of give it all up. And she talks about this phone call that she made to her mother, where she says, I just want to give it all up. And her mother said, well, is that possible? And that story resonates for Noah and me, because when we talk to these adult children, their response in 2014 to 2016 was the complete opposite. Their actual response was, those kinds of comments actually make me want to assert my Judaism and my sense of Jewish identity even more so. So, I think the lesson for us in terms of talking to kids was their strong sense of Jewish identity, I think, was both a positive experience, but it developed out of some, I think, important touchstone moments where they were othered, and those are things that we really need to listen to. So we have a few more minutes before we go into Q&A, and Noah and I thought that maybe we could do just a little bit of a sort of reflection, 2021, going back and sort of thinking about our book in 2016, and maybe talking about things that we're thinking about. And we actually haven't really done this with each other. So this is kind of off the cuff for the two of us. So
because we always run out of time.
So I would just be curious, Noah, to know, like, what are you thinking about in 2021? Given that 2016, one is pre-pandemic, but was the year that we wrote the book.
I'll pick up on the observation that we made about the kids of the Jewish Asian couples, where they did have that strong sense of their identities, often because they had a very strong Jewish upbringing and had some real connection to their Judaism and felt like they could participate in the world as Jews, whether they were questioned or not. And we definitely had some good stories about sort of disruptions to conversations where people would come back to somebody who was questioning their Jewish practice or identity, and they'd really school them in Torah or something, or start speaking in Hebrew. But I guess thinking back is that there a lot of the kind of implied comments that we heard that I think over the last 5 years have borne out have been the kind of ability to be activists, having a strong sense of self, and also feeling able to participate in lots of different kinds of circles and initiatives and campaigns, because there was that feeling of being mixed and being able to kind of move around and be in different circles and being comfortable doing that, and then being able to contribute to that. And I think, a lot of the young people we met, have gone on to be active. And I think, thinking about President Obama, we talked to people during the Obama administration when things were pretty good. And then, what wound up happening was that as things got worse for people who were identified as Asians or Jews during the following administration, a lot of our young Jewish Asian millennials became active and, were very politically involved and led campaigns and, really tried to stand up for a lot of the people that, unfortunately, the president was marginalizing and making horrible comments about. And, our young people were often ones who were in there in the scrum, challenging those remarks. And I think doing so in part because they felt so connected to so many of the groups that were being critiqued and made fun of and insulted, and were also at risk. And the Jewish Asian kids were able to jump into that, and with some trepidation, but also some confidence and ability to, push back. And I think we just got a tiny little bit of taste of that when we heard them talking about, their feeling of people may treat us in a certain kind of way, but we know who we are, and we're going to be out in the world, and we're going to bring all the things that we have, that we grew up with, to the reality that we find ourselves in, and to try to, perhaps in a sort of tikkun olam way, try to scramble or disrupt or challenge some of the concerns that they saw in the society around them. So I guess that would be like my reflection now, thinking back to what we heard and then what we saw over the years following.
Yeah, and I would just kind of add to that and say one of the things that I'm really reflecting on is when Noah and I kind of really thought that we were going to take this idea and these questions forward into a research project, we did a little bit of digging. We really wanted to know, like, are Jewish organizations or institutions, what are they keeping in terms of numbers, stories, with regards to race? And in the early 2000s, we really went and tried to dig for this. And it turned out that there wasn't really, I mean, for the purposes of sort of using academic language, there was really a lot of data that was being kept with regards to race, let's just say in intermarriages. And we actually went to the Union of Reform Judaism headquarters in New York because we thought, here's going to be a place where they're going to keep data on race because they've got all these congregations and they collect data, et cetera. And we had a really seminal conversation with a member of the senior leadership team where we said, do you keep data on race, particularly with regards to intermarriage? And Noah and I will never forget this conversation because the individual that we met with kind of sort of stopped and really thought about it. And he paused and he said, we really don't. And he said, and I wonder if the reason why we don't is because if we collected that information, we would have to acknowledge that racism in the American Jewish community exists. And Noah and I were sort of blown away by that comment. And I think to kind of bring it to 2021, what Noah and I are seeing and what is clearly going on in the American Jewish community is so much attention, a very important attention, and hopefully ongoing attention is being paid to race in a lot of manifestations, and also connections on the basis of race, not only just within the American Jewish community, but with so many other communities. And so I really hold on with hope that that is a story and work that will only continue.
That's
so
really
it's,
good.
yeah. So I would say those are some reflections.
I see that there are a couple questions in Q&A, but I just wanted to ask you one out of the gate.
Yeah.
So, the experts say that by 2050, the majority of the United States will be mixed race. 2011 marked the first year that non-white babies were the majority of babies in the United States. I'm just kind of curious how you reconcile or how you convince people that intermarriage does not swallow, that your culture will not be swallowed up in that process, that your culture will not disappear in that process. Just curious how you, what might be the response to the idea of it being swallowed up?
I actually think of the kids of intermarriage who we interviewed, one of the questions that we asked them, and this is not to say that it's easy, right? That just because you are the product of intermarriage and you feel a strong sense of identity, that path has been easy. One of the questions that we asked of the adult kids of intermarriage is, what advice do you have for parents? And their advice was just give it all to us. Just give it all. Give us everything. Give us all the Jewish stuff. Give us all the Chinese stuff. Give us all the Asian stuff. Give us exposure to everything, all of the above and more. And just have faith that you have given us opportunities that you might feel as parents that you're not doing the right thing. But if you give us those opportunities, we'll kind of figure it out. So they were, I think, sort of saying, parents, lean into that. Don't shy away from that. Don't shy away from the possibility that you might mess things up. Lean into that, give us all those opportunities, and we'll take them. I don't know if you have
I was just
anything.
going to say, yeah, I mean, that's the right answer. The only other thing I was thinking about is how so many of the young people from these mixed households express curiosity about other groups of people around them or in the news or people that they were in classes with. And they just had this wide open desire to understand people with love and energy and sort of amazement, and not just Jewish Asian people, but people of so many different backgrounds. Because I think there was that sense of like, oh, well, I've got lots of things in me, and this person probably has lots of things in them, and this person probably has lots of things in them. Let's bring all that out and enjoy it and learn from it. So that's just something else that kind of was very hopeful that came through, was that that sort of allegiance with so many different parts of humanity through their own sense of how much they had within them.
I concur with that idea of expansion as a product of that same environment. Just like I noticed one of the questions here dealt with what I asked a little bit about. This person was asking, does history record any country or people whose ancestors did not invade or conquer or do violence to previous occupants of the land? I don't have an answer to that question, but I was thinking that that is the thing that erases culture. That's what erases culture. Not necessarily intermarriage, but like conquering and doing that. So I don't know if we want to go through these questions. Are you guys able to see them, the Q&A?
You can, if you don't mind reading them, that's great.
That would be
I'll read it. So the first question was, this is directed to both of you. Did you ever have a fear of what your families would think? Did you ever have fear of what your families would think of the offspring? So I guess that's your families in particular. Did you ever have any fears of what your families would think about your children?
Oh, yeah. Our families.
Mm-hmm.
No, never. Never. It was never a fear. And I can say that I think I count myself as fortunate that that was not a weight that Noah and I had to experience. So I would just say that is me and us. I don't know that we can necessarily generalize that and say that that fear doesn't exist for other families, because it does. We know that that is the case. We know that empirically that is the case.
Your answer matters, though. That matters.
Yeah, right. It doesn't have to be that way, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah, it doesn't have to be an experience of fear.
Next question was, how many of the couples and children converted to Judaism? And were there conversions to either Reform, Conservative, or Orthodox?
Yes.
We're going to pull up
the
Got the data.
Yeah, that's one thing about 2021 is 2016 feels like a long time ago in terms of data. Yes, 6. So if we interviewed 34 couples, the mix of Jewish Asian is a little interesting in terms of thinking about the numbers. So what I'm going to say is we interviewed 34 couples, but of those couples, 41 of those are identified as Jewish. So 6 of the Jewish spouses were Jewish by conversion.
Okay.
So I guess that answers the question.
Okay, that's an actual number. That's great. Another person asked, were any of your interviewees Holocaust survivors or children thereof? And if yes, what difference, if any, did that make?
I'll take a piece of this. We did have some of the kids of the Jewish Asian households talk about how the presence of the Holocaust in their family was something that was a significant part of their Jewish education, awareness, understanding, and that that was seen as a really formative part of their developing that appreciation of their heritage and bringing that into their home and into their sensibility. So, I think actually some of the young people who, as I was saying before, were, kind of activists in their orientation in terms of being involved in efforts to reduce discrimination or whatever it may be, often did that with that kind of in the back of their mind story about a grandparent or a family member that either escaped or died during the Holocaust. That was quite present to a lot of the younger people.
I do have a memory of some individuals in the couples talking about their connection to family members who are Holocaust survivors. And I will say, I that's not something that we specifically kind of went into in depth. And so the presence of that aspect of their family life was not something that we really probed for. But I do, that was present. That was a part of some of the family histories for some of the couples.
Okay. I have a question here that's probably speaking very directly to something that you said during your talk. This person asked, why would not collecting data about race reflect racism? There's probably a couple ways to understand that question, but I'm curious how you understand
Sure.
that.
I think as we understood it in terms of what the rabbi, the individual we talked to on the senior leadership team was saying was, if we're collecting data on race as a social construct is wrapped up in hierarchy in the United States, right? We know that is the case. It's different from collecting data where it's about some equalization of some aspect of identity. So race is necessarily a hierarchical arrangement. It's part of a hierarchical structure that this country is founded on. So I think that this individual was explicitly saying, if we collect data on race, we have to recognize that race is a social construct which reinforces hierarchy. And so to say that there is race or racial difference along a lot of different dimensions within the American Jewish community, if we collect that data, we have to acknowledge the possibility that there's going to be differences in experiences. And he was using the language of racism, very point blank. So I think the terms matter here. And race is a term that is fundamentally about hierarchical differences. So that's what we feel that he was saying. And I would say we agree.
It's like the greatest conundrum as a social scientist, right? It's like we should live in a world where a college doesn't collect racial data. But wait, I want them to collect the racial data so I can see how everybody's doing.
Right. And it's, I would say, in terms of what do we do with it, it's not to say, well, everything is just awful and bad. It's like, okay, things may be awful and bad, and we have a responsibility to make them better. And that's why the data is important.
Right.
It's to know on the ground what is going on that is evidence of important differences so that we can change our institutions and our spaces and our organizations.
Right. We have to be able to measure the progress somehow, right?
Yeah.
So I have a question from somebody who self-identifies as Jew-Asian. He said, and he is saying that there's definitely lots of fear of what the offspring would be, look like, and do back in 1968, I must say. So apparently this person was born in 1968. All worked out more or less. Okay. So this is not a question. This was a comment. He's saying
Yay.
It worked.
Yay.
Love it.
Thank you for your contribution, Daniel.
Thank you.
I have one new question. Are Asian Jewish kids treated as equal by their Jewish peers? That's an interesting question. I guess just in your experience, did you see that the Asian Jewish kids were treated equally by their Jewish peers?
I would say one of the things in terms of the microaggressions is that those microaggressions happened in Jewish and non-Jewish spaces. And I think what I didn't flesh out was that those were the stingiest when they happened in Jewish spaces. So these were other Jews, other Jewish peers, largely Ashken normative Jewish peers, basically saying like, how is that possible that you can be Jewish? Because they might look like me. So in terms of equality, that equality of lived experience was not there because of challenges to their being authentically Jewish because of what it is that they look like.
We did hear a number of stories about kind of using the language of, I had a real chance to educate my friend about, Jewishness, being Jewish, by helping them find out something about me and hear what it is that they said that maybe they didn't really think about or didn't really understand what the implications were. And so there was that, probably exhausting awareness of being in a role to help somebody further their thinking, in those moments where like those stinging comments or whatever it maybe comes through. They were a lot of our young people we heard from, saw the opportunity potential of an interaction like that as over time leading to something a little bit better for the person who made the comment.
Yeah, and I would just say, just to piggyback off what Noah says, it's one thing to have, and maybe this is something to sort of end on, it's one thing to have that individual fortitude and that teaching at the individual level to be able to come back to somebody and say like, yeah, I'm going to stick it to you. I think it's another thing to build structures and spaces where, we can affirm everybody, regardless of what it is that their background is or what it is that they look like, so that that sort of exhausting individual level work doesn't have to happen all the time. So it's not just an individual level thing, but it's also a question about what are the structures that we are building or not building? What are the structures that we want to build so that we have fewer and fewer of those kinds of experiences?
This is reminding me of an article I read a couple of years back. I can't remember the author, but it was a ethnically Chinese woman who grew up Jewish. And she was talking about how she endlessly kind of had to assert her identity in order for people to know, because people want to do it just by looking at people. And she had to add this extra component because of it. Again, I'm not really sure of our time, so I guess I'll do one more question, I suppose. This person asked, did you track the marriages of the adult children of Jewish Asian parents? Check them out. And if you did, how many of these children married Jewish or Asian partners? Did you have that much time to do that?
No, and I would say that's
longitudinal.
probably a 2021 reflection back on 2016. I think if we had all the time and the resources in the world, we would make this really like a truly longitudinal study. And we go, this is around the time when a lot of folks are probably, partnered or thinking about marriage and family. So that's the next research project. How about we get back to that person?
Yeah. 5 years.
Yeah. In the next 5 years with an answer.
That's almost like a generational longitudinal study on that one.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, because the young people really did say that as they were thinking about their future families, they had very clear feelings about wanting to create, strong Jewish households, often like the ones that they felt that they grew up in. So it'd be great to then go be able to check that, because there was a lot that came out in the interviews about what they hoped they would be able to do as they got older and started their own household.
Again, forgive me that I don't know exactly when we're supposed to end, but I'm assuming it's around now. So
thank you, Dr. Milton, and thank you, Dr. Kim and Dr. Levitt. I'm just sitting here reflecting on the power of this conversation. And when we were meeting the other day, we were all talking about sort of our personal experiences. And I was married to someone who was Chinese American, but who had also come from another intermarriage. And I think that even in looking at some of the questions, it's so interesting because some of the questions are on the specific dynamics between intermarriages between Jewish people and Asian people. But also, I think this is a conversation about bringing light and awareness to the experiences of people who are not just like us. And that so much of the work that we do here is not only to bring about education, but to kind of say to our larger society, and also, quite frankly, within the Jewish community, that there are people who have different experiences than us. And part of the onus about learning is on us to do that work, and not necessarily constantly putting a person who appears different to us or, separate from our own experience, having them do the work. And that's the tension that comes out in our society right now. And I also just want to say, unless we question the narratives that are out there, the histories that we're being taught, the way we're speaking within our own community about people who feel other or foreign to us, who might have parts of our identity, the moment is here. As our society is really so much more polarized than it ever has been between us and them, it's finding these commonalities, but it's also, again, incumbent upon each of us to do that work. And it is uncomfortable. And if it's uncomfortable, then you're actually doing the work. So I wanted to thank you both for really just talking so openly about your experience and really giving life to this conversation. Dr. Milton, it is always a pleasure to collaborate with you. And we want to also thank everyone for attending today. You can find the recording soon on our website, and we hope that you all stay safe and well. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We really appreciate
Good
that.
day.